My husband was still in the OR when my sister cleaned out our joint savings account. Every single dollar we had saved for 3 years. Gone? And my father stood right in front of me in that hospital waiting room and told me she needed it more than we did. I remember the exact moment I found out. I was sitting in a plastic chair outside the surgical ward, still wearing the same clothes I had thrown on at 5 in the morning, when my husband collapsed in our kitchen. My phone buzzed. A bank notification. I assumed it was a routine alert, maybe a small charge on the account, maybe something automated. I unlocked my screen without even thinking about it. The balance read 0. I stared at it for so long that the screen timed out and went dark. I unlocked it again. Still 0. I scrolled to the transaction history and saw one single withdrawal. $43,217. Processed at 11:48 a.m. While I was sitting in that waiting room praying my husband would make it through emergency surgery, someone had walked into our bank and emptied everything we had. I need to back up and explain something. Because, without the full picture, none of this makes sense. My husband Daniel and I had been together for 6 years and married for 2. We were not rich. Daniel worked as a project manager for a mid-size construction company in Phoenix, and I worked as a registered nurse at a level 2 trauma center. We worked hard. We lived carefully. And for 3 years, we had been saving aggressively for one goal, a down payment on a house. We wanted to get out of renting. We wanted something that was ours. Every month we transferred a fixed amount into that joint savings account, and we did not touch it. $43,000 was our entire future sitting in one place. My sister Rachel was 3 years older than me. Growing up, she was always the one my parents orbited around. She was louder, more dramatic, more demanding. And my mother in particular had a deep and lifelong habit of solving Rachel's problems for her before Rachel even had to ask. When Rachel racked up credit card debt in her late 20s, my parents paid it. When Rachel's first marriage fell apart, she moved back into their house for almost 2 years. When Rachel needed a car, my father co-signed the loan. There was always a reason. And the reason was always that Rachel was going through something hard. Somehow, Rachel was always going through something hard. I loved my sister. I want to be clear about that. I did not resent her success or wish her any harm. But I had watched my entire life as she received without consequence. And I had made peace with the fact that our family operated on different rules for different people. I kept my distance where money was involved. I did not lend Rachel money. I did not discuss our finances with her. I thought I had protected myself. I had not protected myself enough. Let me tell you about my father. Me dad, Robert, is a retired civil engineer. He is a precise and logical man in every area of his life, except when it comes to Rachel. With Rachel, all of his precision disappears. He becomes soft in a way that I used to find touching and now find terrifying. My mother passed away 4 years ago from cancer. And after that, my father leaned into his relationship with Rachel even harder. She was the one who called him every day. She was the one who had dinner with him every Sunday. I was the one who was always working. Always busy. Always a little too far away emotionally, even though I lived 20 minutes from his house. I accept my part in that dynamic. But I also know what I saw. 3 weeks before Daniel's surgery, Rachel had called me. She said she was in trouble. Her second marriage was ending, this one messier than the first, and her soon-to-be ex-husband was contesting the sale of their shared property. She was waiting on her portion of the equity, but the legal process was dragging on. And she had burned through her own savings covering attorney fees. She said she needed a short-term loan, something to bridge the gap until the property sold. She had already asked my father, and he had already given her what he could. But it was not enough. I told her no. I told her calmly and without cruelty. I told her that Daniel and I were so close to our down payment goal that we could not afford to move any money out of savings. I told her I was sorry she was in a hard situation and that I hoped the property sale resolved quickly. She was not happy. The call ended on a cool note. That was 3 weeks before Daniel collapsed. Daniel had an aortic dissection. If you are not familiar with that, it is when the inner layer of the aorta tears and blood surges between the layers of the aortic wall. It is one of the most dangerous cardiovascular emergencies there is. He was lucky if that word applies that it happened at home rather than in his car on the freeway. I called 911. I stayed on the line. I rode in the ambulance. And by the time we reached the hospital, he was already being rushed into surgery. The attending physician told me it would be several hours. He told me to stay close, so I sat. And I waited. And at 11:48 inches the morning, while I was staring at a vending machine and trying to remember the last time I had eaten, my phone buzzed. After I saw the balance, my first thought was fraud. Identity theft. A glitch. I called the bank immediately. The customer service representative pulled up the account and told me that the withdrawal had been made in person at a branch location 7 miles from our house. It had been processed by a teller. The person who made the withdrawal had presented valid identification and had known the full account number. I asked her to repeat that. Valid identification. Full account number. I was a joint account holder. Daniel was a joint account holder. That was it. Neither of us had given anyone else access to that account. Neither of us had written the account number down anywhere that I could think of. And Daniel was currently on an operating table. I asked which branch. She told me. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were shaking when I called my father. He answered on the second ring, and I told him what had happened. I told him our account had been emptied, and that I thought someone had gotten access to our banking information. I expected him to be alarmed. I expected him to say he was on his way. Instead, there was a long pause. And then, he said, I know about it. The floor dropped out from under me. I asked him what he meant. He said that Rachel had come to him that morning after I had left in the ambulance. She had been panicking about her situation. And with Daniel in surgery and the family in crisis, my father had decided it was the right moment to help her. He had given her our account information. He had our account number because years ago, before my mother died, there had been a brief period where my parents were helping us manage some finances, and I had shared it with them for a legitimate reason. My father had kept it. He had kept it for years. And that morning, he had handed it to my sister. I could not speak. He said that Rachel would pay it back. He said she just needed it temporarily. He said that with Daniel in surgery, it was not like we were going to be buying a house in the next few weeks anyway. He said the property sale was almost finalized and Rachel would have the money within 60 days. He said, I needed to try to stay calm, given everything that was happening, he said. And I will never forget this as long as I live. He said, she's your sister. She's family. I hung up. I sat back down in that plastic chair and I did not cry. I was too far past the point of tears. I had a husband in surgery and an empty bank account, and a father who had just told me that what had been done to me was acceptable because family. I sat there for 4 more hours until the surgeon came out and told me that Daniel had made it through and was being moved to the ICU. I said thank you. I sat back down, and I started thinking very clearly. Here is the thing that neither my father nor my sister knew. 3 months before all of this, Daniel and I had made a decision. We had been nervous about keeping such a large amount of money in a single account. We had read too many stories about fraud, about joint account vulnerabilities, about couples losing everything to a single breach. So we had opened a second account at a different bank entirely. A private account, in my name only, that my husband was not even a joint holder on. We had been slowly, quietly transferring our savings over. Not all at once, we did not want to trigger anything, but in steady increments over 12 weeks. The joint account that Rachel had emptied. At the time she withdrew the money, it had contained $412 and some change. We had moved everything else out months ago. She had stolen $412 and thought she had taken $43,000 in. I did not tell my father this on the phone. I did not tell him that evening when he came to the hospital and sat across from me in the waiting room and told me again, more gently this time, that Rachel was going to make it right. I let him believe what he believed. I was watching him very carefully. And what I saw was a man who was not sorry for what had happened. He was managing me. He was explaining to me why I should accept this. He was doing for Rachel what he had always done, which was removing the consequences of her choices before she had to face them. Daniel was in the hospital for 11 days. On day 3, Rachel texted me. Not a phone call. A text. She said she was sorry for the timing, that she knew things were hard right now, but that she needed me to know the money would be returned as soon as the property closed. She did not say the word sorry for taking the money. She said sorry for the timing. I did not respond. On day 6, my father came to the hospital again and asked me if I had talked to Rachel. I told him no. He said she was worried about me and that she wanted to make things right. I asked him if he understood that what she had done was not a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, but that she had knowingly walked into a bank and stolen from her sister. He said she had not stolen anything. He said she had borrowed. I asked him what the difference was between stealing and borrowing when no one asked permission. He said I was being rigid. I thought about that word for a long time. Rigid. I had watched my sister receive my parents' resources my entire life. I had asked for nothing and taken nothing and built everything Daniel and I had through 7 years of working brutal hours in a hospital and going without things we wanted so we could save for things we needed. And I was rigid. Daniel came home on day 11. He was weak, and he needed weeks of recovery. But he was alive, and he was home. And I held that above everything else. The night he came home, I sat next to him on the couch, and I told him everything that had happened while he was in the hospital. He already knew the broad outline, but not all of the details. When I told him about my father handing over our account information, he was very quiet for a long time. Then he asked me, did they ever actually find out what was in that account? I told him no. Not yet. He nodded slowly. And he said, let them find out on their own. So we waited. It did not take long. 9 days after Daniel came home, my father called. His voice was different. Tighter. He said Rachel had spoken to her attorney and the property closing was moving forward, but that there had been a complication with the disbursement. Her portion of the equity was going to be less than expected because of liens on the property that had not been fully disclosed at the start of the divorce proceedings, which meant she was not going to be able to repay the full amount as quickly as she had told him. And then he said, she told me, you only had about $400 in that account. She said she thought you had moved the rest. And there it was. I let the silence stretch out between us on the phone. My father filled it himself. He said he didn't understand. He said Rachel had been so certain. He said she had checked. I asked him how. Exactly. She had checked. And he couldn't answer that. He said maybe there had been a mistake. He asked me what had happened to the rest of the money. I told him the truth. I told him that over the past 3 months, Daniel and I had been gradually transferring our savings to a separate account for security purposes. I told him that by the time Rachel walked into that branch, the joint account held a few $100s and nothing more. I told him that we had already confirmed this with the bank and that there was nothing more for Rachel to repay because there was nothing more that had been taken. There was a very long silence. My father said, so she didn't actually, I said. She walked into a bank with stolen account information and made a withdrawal without the account holder's permission. What she actually got is a separate question from what she tried to do. He didn't say anything. I told him I had already spoken with an attorney. I told him that what Rachel had done met the legal definition of theft, regardless of the amount, and that what he had done in sharing that account information without our consent was something the attorney was also reviewing. I told him I was not calling the police today. I told him that was a decision I was still making, and that it depended in large part on whether I ever heard a real apology from either of them, or whether I continued to hear explanations about why this was actually fine. The apology never came. Not a real one. Rachel sent me a long message that explained, at great length, the pressure she had been under, and how she had been in a desperate situation, and how she had truly believed she would be able to return the money before we noticed, and how she hoped I could find it in my heart to understand that I did desperate things when they felt cornered. It was a very thorough accounting of Rachel's feelings. It contained almost nothing about mine. My father called twice more in the following 2 weeks. The first call was another attempt to help me see Rachel's perspective. The second call was shorter. He said he thought I was being punishing, and that I was letting this damage our family. I told him I had not damaged anything. I told him that I had gone to the hospital at 5 in the morning, terrified my husband was going to die, and that by noon someone had used my banking information without my permission to take money from my account while I sat in a waiting room. I told him I had not caused that. I told him I had not invited that. I told him that I had spent my entire life being asked to accommodate Rachel's needs, and Rachel's emergencies, and Rachel's mistakes, and that I had done it quietly and without complaint, and that this was the place where I stopped. He said he hoped I would reconsider. I told him I hoped he would think about what kind of father shows up for only one of his children. I changed the locks on our house. I reviewed every shared account, every joint access, every place where my family had ever had any window into our finances. And I closed every one of those windows. I worked with our bank to add additional security protocols to every account we held. I spoke again with our attorney, who confirmed that the dollar amount was low enough that prosecution would be at my discretion, and that my father's liability was complicated but real. Daniel recovered. He went back to work 2 months later. We bought our house 4 months after that. The account Rachel never actually emptied became our down payment exactly as we had planned. Untouched and intact. We got the keys on a Thursday afternoon, and I stood in the empty living room of a house that was finally and completely ours, and I thought about every single person who had told me I was being rigid. My sister did not get her share of the property equity for almost 8 months after the closing finally went through. The liens cost her significantly more than she had expected. She did not have the money to repay even the $400 she had actually taken. And I did not ask her for it. My father and I have not had a real conversation since that phone call. He sends me texts on holidays. I reply politely and briefly. Daniel and I had him over for dinner once, about 6 months after the house, because I did not want to sever that entirely, and because I still believed something in him knew what had happened was wrong. He sat at our table and looked around at what we had built, and he said the house was beautiful. I said, "Thank you." We did not talk about Rachel. We did not talk about the hospital, or the account, or the attorney. We sat and we ate, and it was perfectly civil and completely hollow. I do not know what my father tells himself about what happened. I suspect he has a version of events in which he was trying to help both of his daughters, and it simply did not work out the way he planned. I suspect Rachel has a version in which I overreacted and refused to show grace in a difficult moment. Those are their stories to carry. Mine is this. I was sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, not knowing if my husband was going to survive. And the people who were supposed to be my family chose that morning to take from me. Not because they had to. Not because there was no other option. But because they looked at me and decided I was the one who could absorb it. They were wrong.